Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the score for The Adventures of Robin Hood, about its genesis, because it's an interesting story and actually sort of a thriller almost. Because what happened was that after the success of Captain Blood, Warner's offered the job to Korngold to score The Adventures of Robin Hood, which is going to be the next big movie. It started shooting in September of 1937. And Korngold, in theory, agreed, although he really wanted to return to Austria because he had just finished work on an opera called Die Katharine, which ended up being his last opera. And so he wanted to finish orchestration on it, and he wanted to put together a premiere performance while in Vienna. So he started coordinating with conductor and several singers that he had hoped would perform. And one by one, things just started going wrong. A singer had to drop out. He went off to the Metropolitan Opera, of all places. And so he tried to put together some sort of compromised version of this. And in the middle of it, they received a cable from Warner Brothers saying, could you come to LA within 2 weeks? Because we need to show you this first assembly cut of Robin Hood. And Korngold turned to his wife and he said, maybe this is an omen. Maybe we should postpone this opera premiere to later in the year. And so the opera agreed with that, and they said, we can put together a first performance for you in October of 1938, when everybody he wanted to perform and conduct was available, and their schedules were okay with that. So Korngold booked his trip that very evening, and he traveled with his wife and his younger son, George, because they thought, since he had just been very ill, that the climate would be good for him, the California climate, as opposed to the rainy weather in Austria. And so the journey was a difficult one. George writes that the journey across the ocean, there were a lot of storms. Nonetheless, Erich Wolfgang Korngold was writing throughout the journey. He was sketching out ideas, themes for the movie. Even though he hadn't seen it, he was of course familiar with the legend of Robin Hood, and he did a little bit of research at a library in Vienna regarding the subject. So he had some ideas, and also he made sure, because his father Julius had the idea, why don't you use this theme from this work called Sursum Corda, which is a symphonic piece that he wrote that never was successful. And he's like, why don't you use that main theme as a theme for Robin Hood? And he's like, great idea. So, but he had to ask his publisher if it was okay to use that theme for this movie, and they agreed. So he had the okay for that. So he arrives in Los Angeles. Actually, his train collided with a car, so he was a little bit shaken. And he watches this movie. It was only the first half of Robin Hood. And while watching it, he got increasingly nervous. And he left that screening thinking, I can't do this. I can't do this. This is an action movie. This is not the kind of drama that I was envisioning. It's like, there's sword fights all over the place. What am I going to do? So he panicked, and he wrote this letter, and let's look at this letter, in which he basically says, I can't score this movie. He writes, I have no relation to it, and therefore cannot produce any music for it. I am a musician of the heart, of passions and psychology. I am not a musical illustrator for a 90% action picture. And then later on he writes, I implore you not to be angry with me, and not to deprive me of your friendship. He wrote this to one of the producers of the movie. For it is I who suffers mentally and financially. So he had made this long trip to watch this movie, and he felt he couldn't do it. So Warner's had to accept that. But, and what happens from this moment on is could fill the pages of a World War II thriller, because what happened was that while they were in LA, they received a phone call from Korngold's wife's sister, who said that the Austrian Chancellor at the time had a meeting with Adolf Hitler. And things were looking like Austria was going to join the Third Reich. So everybody was very, very concerned. And so Korngold, his wife, and younger son were in LA. His older son was still in Vienna because they thought, he should stay there because of school. And of course his parents were still there. But his father, thinking that things might take a very dark turn, had already secured a visa for himself and his wife, and they had a visa for their son. and they left on the last day that it was possible to do so without special permission. So they were able to leave Austria, but then the concern was, what about all my manuscripts? Because they're still in the apartment. So Korngold called his publisher, and the publisher sent 2 of their employees to Korngold's residence. And when they arrived there, they saw that somebody had broken into it. Some Nazis had broken into it, had taken a lot of the Korngold's belongings, and had thrown all the manuscript paper into a big pile in the basement. And they were able to sneak in there and steal, basically, almost all of Korngold's manuscripts. And then they were smuggled out of the country by the publisher by hiding the sheet music in between things that needed to be sent away. So that's how Korngold received his manuscripts, all those pieces that he had worked on as a kid. And we now still have them. So it's a fascinating story. And also, with this renewed energy, knowing that his family was going to be okay, his manuscripts were going to be okay, even though things were still very dark, and a lot of the Korngold family's relatives and personal friends, they were committing suicide. They ended up in concentration camps, so that there was definitely a lot of despair. But he felt nonetheless inspired to write one of the most incredible pieces of film music ever. And his son remembers that while he was trying to sleep in his room, he could hear his father through the wall exclaiming, "I just cannot do this. I cannot finish this picture." Because he had 6 weeks to do it, and it's like wall-to-wall music throughout the whole thing.